We'll now turn to our external panel on the uneven geography of K-12 STEM education. These panels have become a mainstay of our board meetings, providing data and context on timely topics that assist us in developing and honing our work in accomplishing the vision goals. Today's panel is the second in our series on the geography of innovation, which started with August's panel on community colleges. I'm grateful to former board member and former chair of the board's External Engagement Committee, Jerry Richmond, for working closely with board member Roger Beachy to ensure a seamless transition in leadership of these panels. Today's panel will highlight the differences and similarities in rural and urban K-12 STEM in-school programs, the role of experiential learning both in and out of classrooms, and the strengths and roadblocks in these communities, irrespective of their geographic location, in providing STEM learning opportunities for all students. I'll now ask Suresh Babu, as the new chair of the External Engagement Committee, to kick us off. Suresh.
Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on the uneven geography of K-12 STEM education. Before we start, I would like to ask board members and others in attendance to please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones during the presentations. As Ellen said, thanks to Jerry's leadership, these impactful panels of external experts have become staple of our meetings. With Jerry's recent departure from the board, we are grateful to Roger for stepping in to assume the leadership of developing and organizing these panels, starting with this one. As many of you know, among his many other areas of expertise, Roger is both passionate and experienced in issues pertaining to the geography of innovation. Roger was part of the National Academy's consensus report that evaluated EPSCoR, and as many of you may recall, Roger pushed the board to embark on Vision 2030, of which expanding the geography of innovation is a key element. Roger, thank you for assuming leadership of these important panels. We are excited to hear from the speakers you have assembled and to a robust discussion after the presentations. Please take it away, Roger.
Thanks very much, Suresh. And I should start by saying, this was a team effort that was led by members of our outstanding board office, and that we'll talk about, that you all have, that you've met previously. And I'm really pleased to chair this panel on a topic that many of us on the board are deeply interested in, yet lack important information about. By learning more, we'll know more about what our how to set expectations for the NSF and some goals to be set too. We have an exciting panel that should generate a vigorous discussion. It's been a pleasure getting to know a bit about each of them as we prepared for today's event. Alexandra and Nadine and Reba have done just an outstanding job in getting us, having us prepared appropriately for this board presentation. The board's vision for the 2030 scope that we talked about earlier highlights the need for a strong STEM workforce, which in turn is dependent on the STEM education that starts in grade school. The board's recent elementary and secondary STEM education indicators report again showed for the 10th year, I believe, a lackluster performance of students on standardized tests in science and math that has largely remained unchanged over this period. In addition, long-standing disparities persist across racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, and have worsened during the pandemic, as we know. The board called in its Vision 2030 for an all-hands-on-deck approach to modernize K-12 STEM education. But what does that mean? And recognizing that geography plays a significant role in STEM education that our children may receive, we first need to understand, quite literally, the lay of the land, and hear from experts who can speak about the strengths of local communities and approaches that can be amplified. Today's panel builds on our August panel that showed how community colleges are an essential component of the nation's STEM education system, providing access to STEM and serving as S&E hubs across the country. In contrast, today's panelists will highlight data, community culture, and successful strategies such as experiential learning to develop rigorous STEM curricula and to train students in critical STEM thinking. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session. It's limited in time, so let's keep our questions coming, but brief. We'll start off our session with Pam Buffington. Dr. Buffington, who is herself a resident of a rural state, Maine, is the U.S. Division Director of Rural STEM Initiatives at the Education Development Center and is a national expert in rural and mathematics education. Pam will highlight data on rural STEM programming, the strengths of rural communities, and the needs of rural America in bolstering STEM K-12 education. Our second speaker, Brandy Huderson, is an assistant professor of biology at the University of the District of Columbia. Dr. Huderson is co-author of studies on urban STEM education. Brandy will provide data and insights of urban STEM K-12 education, highlighting the strengths and the needs of urban communities for a strong STEM K-12 education. Our third panelist is Eric Jolly. He's president and chief executive officer of the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation. Dr. Jolly chaired the 2015 National Academies of Science report entitled Identifying and Supporting Productive STEM Programs in Out-of-School Settings. Eric will talk about the efficacy of STEM programming of the out-of-school education opportunities across different communities. Our final panelist is Michael Guarraia. Michael is an Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow at NASA at the present time. He will share his experiences as a STEM educator in Baltimore County and the importance of STEM experiential learning methods and how that's been applied in his region. Now, at the end of the presentations, as I mentioned, you'll be given an opportunity to turn to ask questions back, and that'll start the Q&A. But now I'll first turn to Pam to start her presentation. Pam, it's off.
Thank you, Roger. I grew up in a rural community and attended rural schools and have spent much of my adult life with rural educators and leaders. My expertise in STEM started early and was associated with my daily rural life and routines. It was a context full of fabrication, tinkering, and applied practice. We had workhorses, and when my father explained how to hook the chain to a log to pull it out of the woods, he said, connect it like this to create a spin force called torque, which will make it easier for the horse to pull. These experiences undoubtedly contributed to my degrees in mathematics and physics education. While not all experiences are the same, it is essential that we reframe the deficit narrative of rural people and places and focus on access to resources, opportunities, and address economic inequality across people and place. Rural residents and their context vary greatly based on location, geographic and community assets, and local economies. Rural schools and communities are not monolithic. They're culturally, racially, and ethnically diverse. They reflect inequitable access to rich STEM learning opportunities. 1 in 4 students in rural communities is a student of color. And in many rural districts, students of color are the majority, such as in districts in Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, Nevada, Oklahoma. Over 9.3 million students attend rural schools. That is over half of all districts in the country and more than enrollments in New York City, LA, Chicago, and the next 75 largest school districts combined. To address economic and social vitality of the country, we must recognize both the assets and unique challenges facing rural schools, communities, and people, as well as the critical role STEM knowledge, skills, and experiences play in their lives. Historic employment is disappearing or changing, with shifts in fishing, farming, forestry, and energy production, which heightens the need and demand for qualified STEM individuals to rebuild the economy and sense of place. Next slide. But there are real challenges. If we continue to ignore them, we'll have dire consequences. Rural schools often lack state-of-the-art technological tools and resources and affordable broadband connectivity. This lack of affordable access to broadband infrastructure, a reality that became much more visible during the pandemic, severely restricts STEM education and career opportunities. Rural schools also face barriers in preparing, recruiting, and retaining STEM educators and leaders, contributing to a severe gap in access to high-quality STEM education, further contributing to the disparity in STEM preparedness. Rural schools do not receive adequate funding. While funding comes from a variety of sources at federal, state, and local levels, almost half are based on local property taxes. Current levels of income inequality exacerbate underfunding of rural schools in some of the most economically depressed areas of the country, as 8 in 10 counties in the U.S. experiencing persistent poverty are rural counties. Rural counties are also disproportionately impacted by climate change and extreme weather events, as they are highly dependent upon natural resources that are affected by climate change. Next slide. Rural STEM education success occurs when we leverage strong relationships, acknowledge a commitment to place, and embrace multi-generational connections to the school as community center. Rural community members are keenly aware of and connected to the places in which they live and work. They have deep and applied STEM knowledge. In collaboration with schools and place-based educational projects, community members can contribute to the development of students' STEM skills and understandings. Community members working in the natural settings often recognize the subtle and ongoing changes in the environment well before formal research is undertaken. They can work with educators and students to collect and analyze data and enhance data skills critical to understanding local issues and contributing to solutions. So my recommendations include reinforce authentic and place-based connections to the community with a commitment to equity and culturally responsive practice. Support innovative recruitment and retention strategies and increase targeted funding for rural STEM professional learning. Increase STEM education collaborative partnerships and external learning opportunities between rural educators, community members, increasing upskilling activities. Target funding for rural higher education access for community colleges, preparation and training for rural educators focusing on STEM domains and careers, and support access to higher level STEM experiences through online enrollment. And finally, increase funding for state-of-the-art technological tools, resources, connectivity, and professional learning for high-quality use in rural schools and communities. Thanks.
Pam, thank you very much for that presentation. We look forward to some discussion following. Next turn to Brandy. Brandy, would you please start your presentation? Thanks.
That's the previous, yes. Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to present today. In order to fully understand urban STEM education, we need to clearly articulate what is considered to be urban. In this context, urban does not follow the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of urban and urbanized areas, which is based in part on population size. Instead, in the education arena, the classification of urban is based on an accumulation of characteristics thought to provide an inclusive definition of urban education. We can discuss public urban education as learning centers that exist in metropolitan areas where there's a tendency for increased cultural and linguistic diversity, as well as socioeconomic diversity. These learning centers tend to have large enrollment and larger student-to-teacher ratios. It is also important to take into account the microenvironment of these schools. For example, there may exist schools where there's a more homogeneous student population with variety in the socioeconomic status of the students, or the student body population is highly diverse, with their community being with their commonality being poverty status. According to Urban Education in America, it is estimated that there are approximately 15 million K-12 students attending public urban schools. Next slide, please. In the United States, there are several barriers facing urban STEM education. An overall examination of funding for urban-focused STEM programs showed an overall lack of cohesiveness at both the national and local levels, with many target populations being oversampled and overburdened with duplicative programming across federal agencies. To provide a little context, in 2012, the GAO reported that across 13 federal agencies with STEM education programs, there was an approximate 80% overlap between program services and target populations. Structurally, there's a lack of supplies and resources and general investment from school systems. Teachers and instructors are provided with insufficient professional development opportunities, which feeds into poor content knowledge and delivery, and inefficient assessment, leaving many students feeling unprepared to persist in STEM. Cultural and psychological barriers can exist in many forms and at times can provide the most formidable barrier. One example of a cultural barrier can be seen with educators who may be unfamiliar with the culture and language of the student population. A review of the literature published by Hill et al. In 2012 found that many pre-service teachers who were not from urban areas had limited experience with cultures and languages other than their own. Another example can be seen with the lack of culturally relevant curriculums. Much of our current educational benchmarks have been adopted from Western curriculums and may not have a local relevance. This can lead to further disconnect for students as they may see no connection between themselves and their lived experience and what is being taught in the classroom. Psychological barriers in some ways can be seen as an extension of or even a result of cultural barriers. Students in urban public schools are often victims of harmful preconceived ideas about both their ability and desire to learn. These preconceptions can manifest in the classroom in the form of lowered expectations from educators. These lowered expectations can affect the rigor of presented contents, excuse me, as some may feel that these students are unable to grasp complex concepts or excel in their academic performances. This can negatively affect how students see themselves, leading to lowered expectations of their own academic performance and presenting outward as a general disinterest in academic achievement. Next slide, please. So what has worked and how do we mitigate these barriers? So here I present 4 examples of programs that have proven to work in the past. So STEM-focused after-school programs. With approximately 7 million children participating in these programs, out-of-school programs have the opportunity to impact and shape the interests of students traditionally underrepresented in STEM. After-school programs allow students the opportunity to learn through solving problems and failing through firsthand, materials-rich, and place-based learning experiences that involve processes of scientific or engineering investigation and practice. The use of culturally relevant curriculum. Development and implementation of STEM curriculum that allows students to center their lived experiences and, as explained by Gloria Ladson-Billing, maintain their cultural integrity. The use of culturally relevant curriculum facilitates a connection between the content and the learners. A key component of this is teacher training, specifically embedding cultural awareness in teacher training and professional development, and actively addressing and removing pedagogy based on bias and exclusion. Inclusive STEM schools. These specialty schools can exist as standalone schools or as schools within a school, and have been seen as a more inclusive alternative to highly selective STEM-focused schools. Inclusive STEM schools base their admittance on students' interest in STEM subjects, as opposed to test and academic performance. And finally, bridge programs, also referred to as college prep or summer bridge programs, are low-cost, intensive programs for STEM disciplines to prepare students to meet academic demands of STEM degree programs and to address non-academic factors that may contribute to the attrition of students in STEM. These programs focus on students who may be less likely to be prepared for college coursework, working to increase their basic subject matter understanding, increase their understanding of fundamentals, and gain access to resources and community support. Thank you.
Brandy, thank you very much. That last slide is pretty impactful with some things that have worked and things that we can learn from. Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Eric Jolly. Eric, the time is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about the expanding role of out-of-school and after-school programs in achieving a pathway towards STEM careers. Earlier research suggested that there were 3 common focal points essential for STEM career progress. The first one, of course, is engagement, having an orientation to, interest in, belief in your ability to achieve, and what we would now call STEM identity. If you have STEM identity, it's a great way to get started in pursuing STEM knowledge. But capacity requires the teacher professional development, curriculum, high quality materials and resources so that a learner can advance to ever more rigorous disciplinary knowledge. If you have an interested, engaged, STEM-oriented learner who has fine access to good quality materials, but the systems don't support them, if there is no AP calculus in their school or other things are missing, then without systems, they also won't advance. But when we have all three, we see student progress. Now, early on, after these reports came out, we saw a lot of the informal education systems, those in out-of-school and after-school programs like museums, library programs, viewing themselves as only focused on that one component of engagement. They saw themselves as iterative and recursive, non-sequential learning environments that didn't have aspirations for curriculum. That has changed in the last 10 years significantly. Today, we have sequential, rich in STEM programs in America. In a survey of over 31,000 households engaged in out-of-school, after-school programming, parents identified the following attributes: social skills being developed in 90% of those programs, physical activity in 85% of the programs, and stunningly, STEM learning opportunities in 73% of those programs. And that's an increase in the study was 2020. That's an increase from a 2014 study of only 69%. We continue to see rich in STEM programs with libraries, museums, community centers, and the rest. Primary areas of STEM, we see mathematics overwhelmingly. 62% of the STEM activity in out-of-school programs is math. Engineering is growing from 30% 6 years ago to now 39%, and science is at 49%. Could I have the next slide, please? That 2015 report, which I co-chaired, asked the questions of what was effective under what circumstance, and quite frankly, the research was thin. But now we've seen a burgeoning of that research. In a recent study of 160 STEM sites across 11 states, we found that students engaged in out-of-school and after-school activities boosted their career knowledge significantly. In 80% of the cases, 78% increased their interest in STEM, and 73% boosted their sense of efficacy. Which programs were effective? Clearly, those that had longer duration. When a program reaches 4 weeks, we get a sharp elbow in the learning curve that shows staying power. And now we find that these programs are not only effective, but they're getting value to parents. Parents are now prioritizing STEM out-of-school learning activities more than ever before. In 2014, we had already reached 53% of parents surveyed saying, yes, STEM is important to the out-of-school, after-school programs that we give our kids exposure to. Today, 2020, is 72%. Sadly, though, there's been a huge impact of COVID. 65% of parents report a quality decrease in their students' STEM learning in out-of-school and in-school programmings during the times of COVID. But clearly, these programs are important. They work, they get kids excited and interested in STEM careers, they teach them the pathway, and they give them curriculum to help them achieve more. Next slide, please. But what we have access to is uneven. Among the top quintile of public school attending families versus the lower quintile, we find that affluent families provide $3,600 per child for out-of-school, after-school programmings per year, and less affluent families, the lower quintile, less than $700 per child. A summer camp in STEM averages $317 per week across the nation. Most families, the median family, can afford a 2.9-week STEM engagement. Summer camps that are non-STEM are a bargain by comparison at $164 per week. We need to be concerned. We need to be concerned because according to recent surveys, cost, transportation, and availability is the greatest impediment to students engagement in out-of-school and after-school STEM. In 2014, 10.2 million children were enrolled in after-school programming. In 2020, that number has dropped to 7.8 million. We see income differentials and quintiles that negatively affect students, particularly in technology and engineering. The poorer students, only 27% have a tech and engineering component to their out-of-school programming, where 44% of more affluent students have that access. 33% of poorer students are in computer programming. 48% of affluent students are in computer programming. The numbers for science are a little closer, 43 and 57%, and math is spot on even at 65% having programs in that. And so there are points of light. 21st Century Learning Centers provide access to students. In 2 years, we've seen a 20% increase in student math proficiency, and these programs serve over 50% of their population are BIPOC, 38% are rural and town, and 70% receive free or reduced lunch. The average expenditure per student is $1,800 per year. Among our other points of light are citizen science programs and new curriculum in out-of-school, after-school programming. I'll stop there and we'll talk about part 2 next time we meet.
Thanks very much, Eric. The data are pretty clear and we appreciate you bringing them to us. The fourth speaker is Michael Guarraia. Michael, the time is yours. We're pretty much on time, but a few seconds late, but we wait for your presentation. Thanks very much.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Beachy. First, a sincere thank you to the NSF. Were it not for the foundation, I'd probably still be engineering away in my cubicle. But in 2006, I discovered my passion for education by participating in an NSF-funded partnership between the University of Maryland and Baltimore County Public School System. It was aimed at getting STEM professionals like me into teaching. I've been in education ever since, both in public and private schools, so thank you for thinking creatively about pathways to the classroom and helping people like me find their niche. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank NASA, my host agency, and the Department of Energy, who sponsors the Einstein Fellowship. When thinking about the geography of STEM education, oftentimes the barriers come to mind first. But I'd like to focus on the positive aspects. I'm speaking to you now from Baltimore, Maryland, and front and center in STEM education here is the Chesapeake Bay. It provides a rich context for STEM education, and the best educators know it's fertile ground for integrating other subjects. In K-5 education here, for example, there's an emphasis on the indigenous people of the region and the relationship between people and this natural resource. And this is just one example of something called place-based education, or using the locality as a foundation for instruction. Place-based education should provide an opportunity for an immersive learning experience and a connection to community. I'll give you another example. NASA has a citizen science project called Mosquito Habitat Mapper. Through a phone app, volunteers can report potential mosquito habitat and the presence of mosquito larvae. Paired with satellite observations of temperature, water, and vegetation, scientists can forecast a community's risk for mosquito-borne diseases. I was tasked with developing a 2-week university-level resource with Shaw University and HBCU in North Carolina. When I got going, I saw a map of the distribution of HBCUs and a map of the distribution of mosquitoes, and they were almost indistinguishable from one another, in that most HBCUs are in the southeastern United States, which tends to be warm and wet, which is favorable for mosquitoes. And so I knew this connection was going to play a vital resource in the role that a vital role in the resource that I developed, specifically with respect to which human populations are at most risk of infection from mosquito-borne illness. In this unit, students select from options of action projects depending upon their interest. It could be asking a scientific question about their region and using the data collected to attempt to answer that question, or it could be some sort of public outreach campaign where they visit their local K-12 school to provide information about how to minimize the risk of mosquito-borne diseases in their community. And so regardless of the option they select, students are doing and contributing to real science. They're collecting and analyzing real data while also considering how the reality of their discoveries impacts their community. I provide these examples to suggest that geography can have a positive impact on STEM outcomes for students. And more importantly, in my mind, that using this sense of place or home as a context for learning can lead to greater sense of purpose in one's community and greater stewardship of that place. Not every locality has the Chesapeake Bay, but every place has some ordinary asset, be it natural, cultural, or even industrial. And when schools are more connected to their communities through these assets, they're more likely to receive support, and the community receives the value of that investment. So you have this opportunity to create a virtuous cycle. If we want future generations that are going to be able to solve the problems that threaten their health and prosperity, place-based education is one tool that we can employ. And so how do we foster more of this? I think it starts with passionate, remarkable teachers. There are many out there already, but we need more of them. To that end, we need to continue to elevate the profession such that our best and brightest are drawn to it and are well prepared and supported to succeed. Programs like the one I participated in 15 years ago can certainly help with this, along with new programs that attract and support diverse teacher candidates and strengthen cultural competencies. Passionate, diverse educators are not enough. As I said, there are many of them out there already. However, they require resources, time, and the opportunity to collaborate. Thinking about that citizen science resource that I developed, it was only possible because I had access to the NASA subject matter experts and citizen science leaders, and we had time to iterate the resource collaboratively. I wasn't hamstrung by grading and planning for 150 students and lunch duty, etc. A teacher's passion can only really play out in the classroom when they're not constrained nor controlled by rigid curricula or other mandates. Teachers need to be offered the freedom to be creative. And I argue that when that happens, you will have more robust learning experiences for students that simultaneously benefit the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Illuminating, to say the least. Do we have a full screen shot? We have time for questions. I think we're due to finish in just over half an hour, 40 minutes, I believe. So we have adequate time for questions. There's already one up, so I won't start with mine, but turn to Melvin. Dr. Huff? You're muted.
What do you find that is different about out-of-school programs that achieve success that can't be implemented in in-school programs?
Michael, is that directed to Michael?
All of them, all those panelists.
Right, all the panelists. Michael, do you want to start since you're the most recent? And then
well, I was going to defer to Eric on that regarding out of school. Most of my experiences in school.
So there are a lot of things that are different. One is that we've relieved the student from evaluation apprehension. We find that that's been a significant impact, which is differentially felt by students of color over white students. So that's one of the things that's distinct and different. You can actually simply explore and learn. It allows for more self-pacing than most programs do. The other thing that happens in out of school and after school programming is students select their interest area within STEM. Finally, I think a part of what we're seeing happening is we have more time. Quite frankly, of the waking hours of a student, only 20% are spent during the school day in school. Other times are great times to capture it. If you take into account the time that children spend sleeping, eating, occasionally bathing, they spend less than 8% of their life in school before they graduate from high school. That leaves a tremendous opportunity for learning outside of the standard rigorous school curriculum. And so freeing students to have, taking part of the day which they have more time, which is volitional, which has less stress and more interest, is one of the greatest ways to engage students in STEM learning. And that's difficult in our high stakes testing environments of schools where teachers are on the spot. And we often, as my friend Shirley Malcolm says, spend more time weighing our babies than we do feeding them.
Thanks very much, Eric. Pam?
Yeah, I'd like to just add, actually, during the pandemic, one of the benefits that became obvious was the opportunities to do more external learning opportunities through online and other types of engagements. And that is an area that a lot of schools are starting to really focus in on, and some state education agencies are putting more emphasis on work that provide opportunities for externships, internships, and other types of collaborative engagements with local workers and businesses. And that's been really beneficial in some of the rural contexts that I work in. So I think it's an and kind of situation where, in fact, if the flexibility in the looking at the schedule differently and providing more of those opportunities to do place-based, more project-oriented types of engagements in STEM, we're seeing very positive results there, including when students have voice in and choice in what they're doing, much like Eric was pointing out in the out-of-school opportunities.
Thank you.
Can I also add to that,
Sure,
please?
Brandy, sure.
So I think in addition to what Eric said about relieving some of the constraints for the classroom, I think it also, these after-school programs have more freedom to design their programs around to address specific cultures. I think the programs can be designed so that they are delivered in different languages, which may be more suitable for the students. So it can really act as a support system to the classroom by giving them this more specialized curriculum.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to add to that, or shall I move to the next question?
I could just add, I know that NASA, through science activation, we have a lot of different programs that are after school, and they are being met with a lot of success, getting a lot of students engaged and interested in science and STEM more broadly. And I know something that Eric mentioned earlier, this notion of STEM identity, or believing that you can succeed in STEM is really a key focus in some of these programs, and it can be pretty powerful.
Thank you. Next is Matt. Matt's question.
Thanks.
Matt Malcolm.
So one of the suggestions that was made, was interesting, is maybe our STEM curriculum needs to be improved. For example, Brandy mentioned specifically making it more culturally relevant. Now, I want to think about that a little bit. I can certainly see some advantage to that clearly in humanities and social sciences. To me, in STEM, it's not so obvious. And so I'd have to be sold on this concept, particularly when you're talking about fundamental things such as math, physical sciences, chemistry. We've got a lot to cover anyway, just to get to the basics. Now, I'd like to see evidence that this actually works. And I'm not just talking about improving students' attitudes, that they're more interested in STEM, they know more about STEM opportunities. Those are good things. I want to see more concrete results of the more culturally relevant, math and science curriculum, such as, for example, are the students doing better in those courses? Are they taking more courses, more advanced courses? Are they more likely maybe to end up majoring in or going to college and then pursuing those, perhaps even to a college degree? I mean, those are concrete things which might change my mind and say, oh, okay, maybe that's a key lever that we have to push. But I remain to be sold on that idea.
Brandy, do you want to take a first shot at this?
Yes. So I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about culturally relevant curriculum, we're not talking about changing the fundamentals. We're talking about adjusting how the information is being presented. So if we are in, for example, I'm from southeastern Louisiana. So we have a lot of water parishes. So if we're presenting information to students about things like climate change, the effects of climate change, if we can relate that to their experiences in the water parishes, if we can talk about things in the context of coastal erosion, or we can talk about how it's affecting our food sources, which are things like shrimp and fish, that's what I mean. So it's not changing the fundamentals that we're teaching to the students, it's helping them to understand them through their experiences. So there is some data that exists examining how this is how these differences in presentation affect student outcomes. I think it's also important to remember that when we are evaluating these changes in the curriculum, that we are also using the appropriate evaluation tools so that we're also asking the appropriate questions of the students so that we can actually get the information that we can actually glean the information that we're trying to understand from the students.
Does anyone else like to add to that, to Brandy's discussion? Or
I'd be happy to. This is Eric. I think that it's an important question that you're asking. There has been some evidence, if we look at the reviews of the statewide systemic initiatives and the curriculums that were developed and implemented around education in Alaska were significantly different than those that we saw in Texas, especially rural Texas. And they each had positive outcomes, not because there's a different math, science, or chemistry happening in one part of the country than another, but there are, as Brandy has pointed out, different metaphors being used. And when we start to speak in the metaphors that are familiar to the students, they begin to get more engaged and they understand the programs. Any 12-year-old basket weaver on my reservation understands of their material, whether they're twisting it and where it will break and what kind of reed they're using, shear compression and torsional stress. They understand the elastic limit of the material. And so therefore they understand Hooke's law, but they didn't know they knew it because at 12 years old, those aren't the words that we use. Those weren't the metaphors we presented. That's where I think we need to go, is looking at in rural America, vastly different experiences than we see in urban America. I recall once screening through some questions for the SAT, and they wanted to know why standing on grass with a bare foot felt cooler than standing on dirt. And in the urban environment, that would be a really interesting question to ask a child to learn, because it is not in their experience. So when we use the metaphor and experience of our students, we give them a chance to show off the knowledge base that they've acquired.
Thanks. Those are all good pieces of information. I do want to mention, I'm sorry, go ahead, Maureen.
Oh, I just wanted I'm speaking out of order, but my question follows up directly on what we were just discussing. Could I just ask a follow-up?
Surely.
Thank you. So I appreciate the notion of kind of tailoring curriculum to students' individual experiences, but I think I kind of share Matt's concern that may apply in a very homogeneous school district, but Brandy, as I'm sure you're aware, in DC, you have such a spectrum of different cultures, and the experiences of the students are really going to be radically different based on, what's their background and the homes they're coming from. So how do you apply this concept of kind of culturally relevant programming to truly diverse populations of students, without essentially making it, I don't know, culturally relevant to the majority minorities, or, or kind of losing everybody because it's not really relevant to anyone's personal experience?
So I think the key to this is to not dismiss a student's approach to a problem or to a topic. So it's impossible to cater a curriculum to an individual, and it's unfair to ask educators to do that. But what we can do is we can ask that we create a space that allows students to bring in their own perception and their own understanding of the content that's being taught. So if the example for physics, like Eric said, is understanding the basket weavers are using those examples, that we make space for those examples. If understanding torque and pressure, if the students understand that in terms of creating race cars or creating mechanical pulleys, because that's what their communities is, that's what they've learned from their community, then allowing them to bring those experiences into the classroom. I think at the heart of things, culturally relevant curriculum is basically creating space for other ways of knowing, for other ways of understanding. And so we can't demonize a student because in their mind, it's not 1 + 2, it's 2 + 1, right? So making sure that they are able to express those small differences when we are presenting the information to them.
Maureen, was that helpful?
Thank you. That was extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I think putting space into a curriculum is a challenge when there's so much material that also has to occupy that same space. But still, I appreciate that answer. It's very clarified in my mind. Thank you.
And I would suggest that space can be found in the time out of school, not just in school.
Got it. Good.
I just want to reinforce that idea, and another couple of examples of that is the importance of the collection and analysis of data and using different examples and contexts to understand the social aspects of the communities in which kids are working. So for example, we have one project which is an extreme weather project called WeatherX, where students analyze data from a mountain within their region of the country, but they get to also go and look at their local data, pull down their local data, and then relate it to specific interests within their particular context. So what does this weather data look like within the context of the extreme storms and connections to their own interests in the community, like fishing or whatever. So it's really thinking about the examples and the context that we're bringing into the work with the same type of high quality, rigorous STEM engagement.
Thank you, Pam.
If I
Next
may.
question is, yes, the next question is to, Michael, is that you? Sorry.
Yeah, if I may, I was just going to add, and this might be a little bit too local, but to your point, Maureen, about curriculum, it often depends on how the curriculum is written and who writes the curriculum. And in Baltimore County, for example, it serves about 110,000 students. I've taught in two different schools in Baltimore County, one being majority Black students and the other school being about 25% each of white, Hispanic, Black, and Burmese. And I was on the team that wrote the curriculum. And so you can imagine trying to write a curriculum that could serve kind of both of those schools, right? And of course, the diversity of other schools that exist within the county, it's hard. And so therefore, I would argue that it's more important to, again, give individual teachers who are going to know their class the best, right? Give them the autonomy to create what's best for their students. They know their students. And when they're too confined or constrained by rigid curricula, it's harder to do.
Thank you. Next question is from Suresh.
I have a question to Professor Brandy. The one which works is STEM-focused after-school programs. One of the critical need for that, you need volunteers and mentors with the contextual working with the students. How can we scale this across the country? So do you see this as a challenge or not a challenge, having contextual mentorship?
I think it can be a challenge, but I think there are many ways to address the challenges. I think it's, one, strategic partnerships. So I think this is where we engage industry, we engage academic institutions of higher education, especially the public institutions for higher ed, have them to reinvest in their communities. These are the communities that are supporting them. These are their tax dollars that are supporting them. So having them to reinvest in these communities. I think we can pull from undergraduate students, we can pull from graduate students to bring them into this process as well. A lot of graduate students are interested in teaching. A lot of STEM graduate students are interested in teaching. So help them, bring them into the space where they're allowed to teach and communicate with these students. I think bringing in industry helps facilitate resources. It helps with inputs to design. It helps to think about what the workforce needs now and what it's predicted to need in the future, so we can expose the students to these things. And at the end, I think it also provides role models for the students. It allows them to see people working in these different fields. It allows them to get an idea of what they can do with these degrees, which at a higher education level is a problem. Lots of our students don't know this. They don't know what they can do with their degrees. So in addition to having to reassure their foundation, having to try to move them through this curriculum, we're also trying to tell them retrospectively what they can do with this degree because they don't know.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Julia?
Yes. So I believe I am the only science board member who is from a really rural area that is at least 3 hours from anything that is a city of sort of 100,000 or more. And so isolation of some of those rural areas, lack of broadband access, raises a lot of questions about access to out-of-school programs, for example. Also raises questions about access to qualified science teachers you know, online things are great, but you have to have broadband. So I'm wondering what Pam and Eric, I think in particular, may have in response in terms of thoughts about that.
Well, I can start because I think that what happens in lots of rural communities, you're absolutely right. The highest priority item for educators across the country currently in a national survey that we just conducted was recruiting and retaining STEM teachers, particularly science and math teachers. So you're absolutely right, and the data supports that. What we find, however, is that often inside the classrooms, people think about science as very narrowly defined. And so they don't tap into the expertise in the community and the ways that they could build much more rich opportunities. For example, in Maine, we have some different projects through the Gulf of Maine Research Center, Real World, Real Science, for example, where they tap into the fishermen as well as the clam diggers and worm diggers around invasive species. So they really tap into the deep expertise of the marine ecology within that community from people who are there every day working with that data. So it doesn't overcome the lack of teachers that we have. We still need to provide more innovative opportunities to recruit and retain rural teachers, including things around housing and other types of approaches. But we also are not taking full advantage because some of the restrictions that others here have talked about in terms of rigid schedules and ideas of keeping everything inside the classroom walls. And so that's really critical, Julia.
And I would simply support everything Pam has said. There's no denying broadband access is a critical issue for quality education around the nation, and we need to start attending to it. But we also need to break out of the school and do, as Pam says, find alternative ways to engage the community in the teaching of young people. This has happened. We saw in Maine, it was with SALT, a project from many decades ago. We've seen it in Appalachia. We're seeing it now in rural districts in South and Central America through programming that's happening out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They've taken citizen science and used it as a tool to provide resources to classroom teachers so that the kids are bridging their out-of-school learning and bringing in data inside the school and contributing to international science databases for data mining, which gives them incredible applications for mathematics learning as well. So we need to look at models that aren't curriculum based in a book. That's long since gone, and we can find other ways by connecting to citizen science in particular.
Thanks, Eric. If I could just follow on from that, with this challenges of finding of educators remaining where they have experience and moving on, as Pam suggested, what we need to do to hold what needs to be done to hold talent together. Are there generational challenges that you've seen in teachers? And Michael and Pam have mentioned this turnover. Are these generational things? Are younger teachers more likely to be engaged and have more modern ways of understanding how science is taught? I mean, our schools of education, those that NSF supports, are they doing their job differently than they were and giving you better teachers that last longer?
Well, I think in the rural context, we do have a really nice model where teachers that have been in the profession for a number of years combine with and work with colleagues that are younger. An issue in the rural schools, however, is that we have a mobility problem where we'll have teachers, new teachers come to the school, stay in the school for 2 or 3 years, have a professional certificate, and then have urban flight or suburban flight where they are paid more for their time, as well as have access to other resources. So yes, in fact, we have new ideas. I think part of it is opening up the structure of what's possible in education. Some of the funding that came out of the US Department of Ed this last year called Rethinking Education within the context of COVID really has opened up the opportunities for outdoor education, maker spaces, and other things that are based on looking at the school schedule differently. But we have to have some real resources put to preparing and then providing structures that support them to stay in these schools as well.
Thanks, Pam. The next, Vic, I think you're next.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Roger. And thanks to all the panel members, and a special shout out to Dr. Huderson, who's my colleague over at the University of the District of Columbia. This is a question because to Eric, but any of the other panelists can chime in. But Eric, you talked about these three pillars that are important, and one of them was experiences. A couple of years ago, our board here, our colleagues, we got together and we looked at the value of the skilled technical workforce. These are people who have used STEM skills but don't have college degrees, people who are electricians, plumbers, IT folks. And actually, they are the larger proportion of the STEM population, according to the National Center on Science and Engineering Statistics. Have you ever thought, it's as we sometimes call in the vernacular blue collar STEM, worked with the local trade unions and trades who right now, for example, electricians, there's about 100,000 person shortage across the country. And the skills and equipment they use are far different than what we would think of the electrician 50 years ago. They use a lot of thermal imaging. They do a lot of Laplace transforms. They do a lot of coding, but you don't need a degree. But as the NSF director said earlier about multiple pathways to STEM, you could think of this as one pathway for a large proportion of students where they can get hands-on experience and have that. Have any of you all thought about that one aspect in terms of getting more students, whether at the high school level or middle or grade school level, in terms of getting involved and interested in STEM from the experiences of the trades?
I want to thank you for that question, because I think it leads to a lot of creative thoughts that we should be pursuing. But I can't say that I'm aware of many programs that do it in that manner. We are seeing a real effort to recruit into those disciplines through our community college systems in several states that I work with. And we're still seeing the same problem of workforce shortages that we're seeing across all STEM disciplines, whether they would be blue collar STEM or white collar STEM. And so we haven't cracked that yet, which I think is a fascinating challenge. The other side of that question is, how do we use people in those disciplines as ambassadors towards STEM?
Yes.
And that's the part of your question that presents a great challenge. And I'm now going to bring that to the next meeting of Association of Science and Technology Centers. So thank you.
It's an issue that certainly has come up in conversation among rural experts and researchers. And Hobart Harmon and Jerry Johnson have started working with some folks in Australia to look at models to provide pathways for what we call middle skilled technical workforce. Mm-hmm. So in addition to making sure that there are AP opportunities for students in rural schools, there's also a real effort to make sure that pathways are not closed off for students going to community college and acquiring those middle skills as well. So those are some areas where we can explore models in other countries, particularly Australia.
I just want to interject and then Roger, I turn it back. But if you can make a connection, and history has shown us this before, and Julia, my colleague on the board, you know, in another life, we worked at a place called Bell Labs. But in the 20s and 30s and 40s, the communication systems were all mechanical. And so they really went out to the rural areas because the people they needed were people who had worked in, who had mechanical aptitude. And a lot of people from the rural areas worked on farms and things like that. That's where they went. If there's a way with where we have the demand now for workers, we can find those shared experiences. And that's why I really liked what Dr. Huderson and what you said, Eric. Connect those experiences to these new areas of opportunity, then it might provide a narrative in being able to attract more students?
I think there's also a social component to that as well. I think somewhere around between middle school and high school, there was a push to be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, something that had a 4-year degree plus. And so we kind of pulled students away from these technical jobs. A lot of vocational programs did not persist. And so the students we're pushing students into college, into 4-year, 2-year institutions that may not need to be there. They may be much happier, much more successful in other careers, but we're not giving them that space. And so I think there needs to be a messaging change from the very beginning to the end about these are other careers. These are very valid careers. These they are productive, they pay well, which I think is really important to students who are experiencing poverty. And so, but we don't do that. We push students to become doctors. We have students that enter into 4-year degrees and don't know about PhDs and master's degrees, but they know about MDs, dental vets. So I think there needs to be a reframing of this at the very beginning of the educational process.
Thank you very much. There's a vigorous discussion going on in chats or comments made. I hope you all are reading those as we go through this panel as well. Mel, do you have a second brief question? I have.
Yes. What percentage of students are signing up for these out-of-school programs, and what's the distribution among different groups who are signing up?
Start with anybody who's got an answer right quick.
Sure. So
Brandy,
one in three students nationwide have access to out-of-school, after-school programs. For each one that's engaged in an out-of-school, after-school program, there's a list of students that are on the waiting list. The shortest waiting list is in Vermont, where there's 1 student for everyone enrolled in an out-of-school program. The longest is Utah, where there are 8 students on the waiting list for every 1 slot filled. And while we talk about there being access to out-of-school, after-school learning for up to 75% of the students, only 1 in 3 parents have awareness and capacity to access those programs. So they are oversubscribed and underrepresented.
Thank you, Eric. Good answer. Others? We go to Suresh.
Yeah, hi. Since Vermont was brought up, I'll take all the credit for that. And Dan Reed, you're at the other end of the scale, so go figure. Hey, and Julia, we're very, very rural too. So I really enjoyed the presentations. I wonder if there's a way to capture folks like you as resources. I don't know if they can have a little database in NSB or NSF. We keep having these great groups present, and maybe under different headings, if you're all open to it, it'd be nice to sort of have your contact info. So maybe not publicly available, but to the board members, that perhaps as things come up even a year from now or so, we could reach out to you. The question I had was particularly for Pam. The very last slide, Pam, you showed had some good ideas. I guess my question is, who is it targeted to? Who are those suggestions targeted to? And really the question is, in so many cases, it seems like we do well with anecdotal things. There are small sort of localized research elements or studies. I'm just wondering if you have ideas about how one scales this up. There's state governments, there's local governments, there's potentially federal government, foundations, et cetera, but have you thought about a way to actually make this something that is scaled up, scalable nationwide and be provided where it's not available today? Thank you.
Well, I think one thing that is critical is really to understand the complexity of the issue and the ability to reinforce some of these strategies across locations and projects as well as funding sources. So for example, Brandy, myself, Eric, Michael, all of us have recognized in the research the really powerful nature of tapping into place and culture as a critical theme that has to go through curricula, professional development, and so on. And so to be able to leverage that and have particular understandings of what that looks like in different contexts. that may not be the best to use a competitive grant program in a rural place, but maybe be a different type of funding. So the idea of thinking about how do these ideas scale is to first have targeted funding to make sure that there's adequate research to be able to point to and evidence that these exist, and then integrate that into different grant programs and strategies. I think that one of the things that has been a critical missing link for at least the last decade and a half, if not longer, is the shift to not have targeted professional development funding. Everything is tied to, we do a lot of work, and NSF has funded incredible programs, and oftentimes they don't scale as far as they could because there are not funds specifically targeting the professional development of educators to utilize those. So there are some nuggets in those recommendations that I think are both policy recommendations and programmatic recommendations.
Thank you very much, Pam. Others want to add to that? I should mention as a follow-up to Suresh's question, I think, there will be online resources that are being made available by the presenters today that I think will be helpful for those of us who want to pursue additional information, and that'll be part of what you'll get as a board. So I hope you'll continue to do that. That really was a good sort of lead in, Pam, to this whole question of how can NSF help? How could resources be directed to take successful programs and magnify them, spread them? Are there other ideas that the four of you have? We've got a few minutes left, just about 5 or 6. Do sort of final thoughts for each of you about how the NSF can help facilitate the successful programs that you've described, or address challenges? What additional research should be done, or what can be done in pedagogy, or how can we stop? Was it you or Brandy that mentioned the overlap between agencies? There's too many duplicating and not thought-provoking overlap. Ideas from each of you? Do you want to start, Pam? And then we'll go right down the line.
Yeah, there's one thing that's an interesting model that I'll just use Maine, but it's happening in other places too, that there is actually the ability to have what are called seed funding, so that you have a whole directory or database of these types of programs with a research base that then have targeted funding that's available to iterate on those programs. In other words, we know that it works in this setting through this particular targeted funding. That is available with X number of dollars to take it and put it into your context and implement it. So for example, building off of those kinds of place-based examples that we have all referenced, but Michael was talking about, for example, there are a number of those citizen science initiatives in the Gulf of Maine, in the Gulf of, in Maryland and so on, that those are existing, but there are not the funds targeted to actually move those into the field. So really taking advantage of what NSF and others have funded over time. The other thing is to not focus completely on, as I said, having funding that's competitive in nature for those that are the least resources, have the least abilities with grant programmers to support the kind of applications that are required, providing more flexibility and partnerships so that we can leverage those resources with lower resource communities. Those are some of the examples.
Thank you. Brandy?
So I totally agree with Pam. I think that taking the data that already exists and building on that data with application and not collection of more data, I think our students are at a point now where we need to be putting plans to work. I don't think we can wait another 5 or 10 years because the numbers are not changing. And so I think that the concentration needs to be on implementing programs. I think that they're, in terms of STEM teachers and STEM educators in K through 12, I think there can be a push to provide them with stronger professional development, and not just sitting in a class or sitting in a week session, but how do we partner them with, how do we create partnerships for them with different STEM professionals so that they can experience the full STEM enterprise, and that has a trickle down effect into their classrooms.
Good, thanks very much. Eric.
I'd suggest there are some really wonderful resources. America After 3 p.m. did a STEM report in August of 2021, worth looking at. The Afterschool Alliance has a lot of data around these things, but a few things that I would support, hope NSF would support. Creating a research infrastructure available through universities to support out-of-school and after-school programming, because you're asking the people who are doing the programming to also have a level of expertise in evaluation research that they don't have, and is not a keen use of their talents. Expand the role of citizen science. Citizen Science Association in the United States, founded, I think, 8 years ago or so, I should know, I was there, had an argument. We were debating, what's the focus on community-informed science, and what's the focus on helping research scientists and laboratories gain their data? Because of the scarcity of resources, we haven't helped them expand from those questions to how do you disseminate? How do you engage more broadly? How do you create networks so that we can do both and instead of one or? And then finally, I just want to give a 1+ to Pam's idea. We need to make our resources more easily accessible to those who are doing the work, but not professional grant writers.
Thank you. Good. One more question a comment from Michael, then Dan has a question. I have a couple of remarks.
Yeah, I would say focusing on teacher quality is really important. And so things like the Robert Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program or PAIMS, those types of things that elevate the profession and get more kind of high quality individuals into the profession is really important. So continuing to fund and support those efforts are really important.
Thank you, Mark. Dan, you have a question that I didn't see earlier.
Well, it's more a comment. I just wrote in the chat. I want to connect it to something that Suresh said. I mean, and really related, Roger, to something I think you were trying to say earlier. We're talking about a systemic structural problem here. And in some sense, we know things that are effective interventions, but we have no mechanism to replicate them holistically at the national scale. And it seems to me, unless we solve that problem, we're going to keep talking around the margins. So some of this is how federal agencies change how they behave, but some of it is an artifact, and I don't want to wade into the morass of local school district control because many people have died in that quicksand, but it is part of our national challenge relative to global competition. So it feels like we need to raise the discussion up like 3 levels higher and talk about how we change our national approach. Otherwise, I fear we're going to keep having these discussions about here are great ideas, and these are all great ideas and they're clearly effective, but scale is the key to success. And I'll climb off my soapbox now, but that's kind of what I worry about.
I don't disagree at all with what you said, Dan. The question of more studies or waiting until we have the solution to how to scale more. Meanwhile, waiting for more of the examples like what Pam and all of our panel have said today needs to be dispersed. And I don't know the best way to do it either. So we have examples of what can work and be effective. This was a really fantastic panel. I've only got 2 more minutes. Actually, I'm out of time. But again, a reminder that there are resources on additional things will be made available to the board, additional reading materials. I want to thank the board for the challenging questions that you ask our panel. But I also want to thank the panel for being prepared for this and leading to this really energetic conversation that has benefited those. I hope it's helped you all as much as it's helped us. We've long known that K through 12 education is a vital piece of the puzzle that has to be addressed to strengthen our position as that global S&E keystone nation, and to provide at the same time economic benefits to every American. So the board will continue its work. It's grateful for your contributions to our discussion. It will be truly helpful as we move forward. But before I close, I want to thank once again the wonderful team at the NSB that worked together with me to identify the panelists and then worked with them to hone the message in the way that's most useful to us. Alexandra, Nadine, Reba, and others, you guys are great, and we'll see how the next one comes. But we've got everything to be grateful for today for the work that they've done to lead to this panel. So thanks again, everyone, for what you've done. A round of applause for our panelists and for yourselves for the questions. It was a good hour and a half spent. So Suresh, back to you.
I think I'm supposed to just say thank you very much, and I believe give it back to Ellen.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Roger. And of course, a big thank you to Pam, Brandy, Eric, and Michael for your important information, sharing your expertise with us, and to everybody on the board for the lively discussion that we had. I hope we can continue to engage with you as we move forward with our own efforts on this critical issue.